Story 1. The map that changed a border. The rain in the small capital city of K always seemed to fall sideways, driven by the winds that swept down from the northern plateau. You wouldn't think this weather would be the backdrop for one of the quietest yet most consequential crimes in the history of two neighboring kingdoms. But in the dimly lit archives of the Ministry of Land Affairs, sometime between 1962 and 1963, a folded piece of parchment disappeared. It wasn't just any parchment. This was the North Ridge Demarcation Map, an 1834 survey signed by both monarchs of the time, a document that established, down to the last curve of the riverbank, where one kingdom ended and the other began. Its disappearance would, years later, redraw 42 kilometers of border, shift the ownership of 3 villages, and leave both sides claiming betrayal. You have to imagine the scene. Dusty shelves stacked with rolled maps, the faint smell of leather-bound ledgers, and a single archivist on duty after hours. In those days, there were no security cameras, no electronic locks, and the logbook of visitors was filled in pencil. If someone wanted to walk out with a folded map under their coat, all they needed was a calm expression and the right excuse. The prime suspect, at least in hindsight, was a man named Otto W., a mid-level cartographer whose career had stalled. He had access to the archives, a reputation for sharp eyes, and according to later interviews, a quiet bitterness about the way promotions passed him by. But back then, no one connected him to the theft. After all, what use was an old map to anyone but historians? The answer came almost 2 decades later, when the Northern Kingdom presented a restored copy of the border map during an international arbitration. This version placed the river bend and the fertile land it enclosed firmly within their territory. They insisted this was the original 1834 map, preserved in their archives. The Southern Kingdom, of course, accused them of forgery, but with the original missing from their own records, their case was weak. Investigators began piecing together the chain of custody who had seen the original when it was last photographed and who had requested access. It was during this review that Otto W.'s name surfaced again, a quiet ghost in the visitor logs, always just before a series of minor misplacements in the archive. Yet here's the strange part. Otto had died in 1972, long before the map resurfaced in the Northern Kingdom's claim. So, if he had stolen it, how did it get there? Was it sold? Passed through diplomatic hands? Hidden until the right political moment? The disappearance of the map was not the sort of crime that drew newspaper headlines at the time. It was, at most, a bureaucratic embarrassment. But as the dispute escalated, it became clear that the loss of one document could alter the fate of hundreds of lives: farmers who woke up to find their land now in another country, children who suddenly needed passports to visit grandparents, and 2 governments locked in an argument neither could fully prove or disprove. In the years following, whispers of similar document disappearances in other ministries began to circulate. Were these isolated acts of petty theft, or part of a quiet campaign to manipulate history through paperwork? Theories abounded, but solid evidence remained elusive. And so, the question lingered. If Otto W. really was behind the theft, who was he working for, and what else might have been stolen from those shelves without anyone noticing? By the time the 2 kingdoms met in the arbitration chambers of The Hague, the North Ridge Demarcation Map had already acquired a mythical aura. Diplomats handled it like a sacred relic. It was shown only under glass, with a cloth-draped official turning each corner for the panel of judges. Every movement was deliberate, as though the map might crumble at the touch of unworthy hands. The Southern Kingdom's representatives, however, did not hide their skepticism. To them, the map was an elegant forgery, clever, yes, but flawed in ways that only an archivist would notice. The ink lines were just slightly too sharp for something supposedly drawn in 1834, and the vellum's tone was subtly wrong, as if it had aged under artificial conditions. But proving forgery requires the original for comparison, and that was precisely what had gone missing from their archives decades earlier. The most recent photograph they had was from 1959, a grainy black and white image in which the river curve appeared marginally different. It was enough to raise doubt, but not enough to win a territorial dispute. The court ultimately split its decision, a ruling that, in practical terms, favored the Northern Kingdom. The disputed villages, the river bend, and the fertile floodplain were ceded northward. For the southern villagers who lived there, the change was immediate and bewildering. Overnight, their postmen arrived in a different uniform. Tax collectors knocked on their doors with forms printed in another language. Children were told they would be schooled under a new curriculum, with a new anthem and flag. This was not the sort of crime that left fingerprints or crime scene tape. It left instead a deep wound in the collective memory of those who lived through it. And as officials in the South tried to make sense of their loss, their attention turned once again to the archives and to the man whose name kept surfacing in the logs, Otto W. Otto's personnel file painted the picture of a quiet, methodical man. He had begun his career as an apprentice cartographer, sketching minor provincial maps for government records. By the early 1950s, he was entrusted with more significant assignments: survey corrections, boundary confirmations, and map authentication. Colleagues described him as obsessive about details and unmoved by small talk. He had no family, lived alone in a modest apartment, and took long walks in the city's older quarters. His superiors noticed his precision but also his rigidity. Otto did not adapt easily to new procedures. When the ministry introduced a new filing system in 1961, he resisted, insisting that the old ways preserve order. Around the same time, he began making frequent requests to access historical documents for professional reference. These requests were always granted. The archives were open to ministry staff, and Otto's role gave him reason enough to be there. Then came the first incident, a minor map from 1887 misplaced for several weeks before being found misfiled under a different region. A year later, a survey ledger vanished for 6 months, only to reappear in a locked cabinet in another department. None of these incidents seemed urgent at the time, but in hindsight, they traced a pattern: items disappearing just long enough to be copied, altered, or perhaps sold. The theory that Otto was working with foreign intelligence gained quiet traction in the years after his death. Some pointed to his occasional visits to a small bookshop owned by a retired northern diplomat. Others recalled that Otto had once spent a summer, on holiday, in the North, an unusual choice given the political tensions of the era. Still, without direct evidence, the investigation faltered. Otto had died suddenly of a heart condition, leaving behind only a few boxes of personal effects, books on topography, faded postcards, and an assortment of drafting tools. If the original North Ridge demarcation map had ever been in his possession, it was long gone. But the map's reappearance in the Northern Kingdom's archives was too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Just months before the arbitration case began, their Ministry of History had announced the rediscovery of several 19th century documents in a warehouse. Among them was the very map that would soon become the centerpiece of their border claim. The Southern Intelligence Service quietly sent an officer to investigate this supposed warehouse discovery. His report, now partially declassified, noted that the warehouse in question had been leased only 5 years earlier and had no record of holding government property prior to that. He concluded with understated confidence that the documents were planted there to provide a plausible origin story. Yet even this lead went cold. No one could prove when the map had crossed the border or through whose hands it had passed. The trail dissolved into rumor, an exchange in a Vienna cafe, a locked briefcase left in a train compartment, a nighttime meeting in a consulate basement. What made the case particularly frustrating for investigators was that no one, not even the Northern archivists, could agree on whether the map was genuinely original or a sophisticated replica. It was as if the uncertainty itself had become the most valuable tool in the political play. And so, years after the arbitration ruling, the unanswered question remained. Was this an act of personal greed by a disillusioned cartographer, or the slow, patient work of a state operation designed to rewrite the land itself? When the arbitration ruling was handed down, it carried a tone of finality. Borders were to be redrawn, jurisdiction transferred, and records amended. But for those living in the affected villages, the decision was only the beginning of a long and confusing transformation. The day after the verdict, local police from the Northern Kingdom arrived in their crisp gray uniforms, replacing the familiar green of the South. Shop signs began to change languages. The post office closed for 2 weeks to transition its operations. Farmers found themselves reporting to a different agricultural ministry, one with unfamiliar quotas and taxes. And yet beneath the surface, there was a quiet resistance. Some families kept their southern passports tucked in drawers, renewing them in secret through relatives across the border. Others refused to update land deeds, hoping that one day the border will come back. In taverns, people told stories about Otto W. as though he were a ghost haunting both kingdoms, a man whose theft had tilted the map and stolen their future. For the Southern investigators still chasing the truth, the case became an obsession. In 1984, more than 2 decades after the map's disappearance, they located an aging former customs officer who claimed to remember a peculiar inspection in the mid-1960s. According to his account, a diplomatic vehicle from the Northern Embassy was waved through without search, carrying a leather-bound portfolio about the size of a folded map. He had been ordered to clear it without logging the crossing, a detail that struck him as odd even then. If true, it was the closest anyone had come to tracing the map's journey, but the officer's testimony was dismissed as circumstantial. Too much time had passed, and no corroborating records survived. Still, it added fuel to the theory that Otto had indeed passed the document to the north through diplomatic channels. By the late 1980s, technology began offering new investigative angles. Forensic document examiners developed methods to analyze ink composition and parchment fibers without damaging the artifact. Southern officials petitioned The Hague to allow a re-examination of the disputed map, hoping to prove it was a modern fake. The request was denied. The Northern Kingdom refused access, claiming that the map was too fragile for further handling. This refusal only deepened suspicions. In confidential briefings, Southern intelligence officers began referring to the case as the perfect crime, not because it was flawless, but because it was irreversible. A stolen object, altered or replaced, had already shaped reality. The border had shifted, treaties had been signed, and entire communities had adapted to the new order. Returning to the old boundary would have meant unraveling years of governance, which no court was willing to do. In the early 1990s, a journalist named Marta V. reignited public interest in the case. She published a series of articles based on interviews with Otto's surviving colleagues, diplomats, and archivists. Her reporting revealed a crucial detail. Otto had once been reprimanded for unauthorized after-hours presence, in the archives a fact absent from his official personnel record, but remembered vividly by a night guard. According to the guard, Otto had explained he was rechecking an old survey for accuracy. The reprimand was mild, but it hinted that Otto's late-night visits might have been more than innocent. Marta's series painted Otto not as a spy, but as a man manipulated by larger forces, perhaps persuaded that he was correcting a historical wrong, or promised recognition from the Northern Kingdom for restoring the border. She floated the idea that Otto's bitterness toward his own superiors had made him susceptible to flattery and persuasion from outside agents. Whether or not her theory was correct, it resonated. Villagers began to speak of Otto not as a thief, but as a tragic figure, a pawn who had played his role and then died before seeing the full consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, the official file on the case gathered dust. With each passing year, the political appetite for revisiting the dispute diminished. Younger generations in the affected villages grew up identifying with the Northern Kingdom, their accents shifting, their school books describing the border as it had been since the arbitration. And yet, in the Southern Ministry of Land Affairs, one archivist kept a personal folder labeled simply NRD map. Inside were photocopies of visitor logs, grainy photos of the map from 1959, and Marta's newspaper clippings. Tucked into the back was a handwritten note, undated but clearly recent. It read, "If the original still exists, it is not in the north. It is hidden. Perhaps Otto gave them a copy, keeping the real one for insurance. If so, it will surface one day, but not while it is still dangerous to the living." The note was unsigned. No one knew who had written it or why it had been placed in the file, but it left a lingering thought in the minds of those who read it. Perhaps the North Ridge demarcation map, the real one, still lay folded in a drawer in some forgotten corner of the South, waiting to tell its true story. And that's the uncomfortable reality about this kind of crime. Sometimes the most valuable evidence is not destroyed, but simply misplaced, biding its time until history is ready to hear it. Story 2. The Post Office Key Heist. If you were to walk past the Central Post Office in H in the mid-1970s, you wouldn't have given it much thought. It was the kind of building that didn't ask for your attention, square, beige, and humming quietly with the sound of mail sorters and rubber stamps. But behind those dull brick walls was a system that kept the country's letters, money orders, and confidential communications moving. And in 1976, a single missing key would expose just how fragile that system really was. It started, as many things do, with routine. Every weekday morning, postal workers collected incoming mail from locked street-side boxes. These boxes were scattered across the city's sturdy, blue-painted metal with a front slot for letters and a keyhole beneath. The keys themselves were kept in the post office's secure key cabinet, a tall, locked structure in the supervisor's office. Each key opened a specific set of boxes, and each was signed out by an employee at the start of their shift, then signed back in at the end. That's why it was so unusual when, one Monday morning in April, key number 42 didn't return. It had been signed out by a temporary postal worker named Glenn M., a man in his early 30s who had been on the job for only 3 weeks. Glenn claimed he had misplaced it somewhere between his route and the depot. He was apologetic, visibly nervous, and promised to retrace his steps. At first, the supervisors treated it as an embarrassing mistake. Spare keys existed, after all, and a locksmith could change the locks on the affected boxes. But the head of security, a man named Arthur P., didn't like the timing. The missing key covered 28 collection boxes across the city's financial district, boxes that often contained business payments, payroll checks, and sometimes even cash envelopes from smaller firms. 2 days later, the first complaints arrived. Businesses reported that important payments sent the previous week had not been delivered to their recipients. Then came the reports from citizens' birthday cards with cash missing, bills paid but never recorded by the utility company, and in one case, a registered letter containing legal documents that had simply vanished. Arthur realized they weren't looking at a lost key. This was theft, systematic, targeted, and likely committed by someone who understood the postal schedule. The pattern was too precise. Only boxes on the key number 42 route had been hit, and the thefts occurred during hours when the boxes should have been secure between scheduled collections. Glenn, unsurprisingly, became the prime suspect. He insisted he had nothing to do with the thefts. According to his statement, he had finished his Friday route, placed the key in his work jacket, and gone to the staff canteen. Over the weekend, he had attended a friend's wedding in a neighboring town, and only on Monday morning had he realized the key was missing. He believed it had slipped out in the train station or been stolen from his jacket pocket. But Arthur found the story thin. The key cabinet log showed Glenn had checked out key number 42 an hour earlier than necessary for his shift that Friday. He had also been seen lingering near several of the boxes before his official collection time. Still, Circumstantial evidence wasn't enough to bring in the police without risking embarrassment to the Postal Service. That embarrassment arrived anyway. Within a week, the total reported loss had climbed into the thousands, not only in cash, but also in negotiable money orders, which could be cashed at any post office with minimal verification. The thieves, whoever they were fast, confident, and seemed to know exactly which envelopes to open and which to leave untouched. Arthur decided to take matters into his own hands. He arranged for plainclothes investigators to monitor several of the affected boxes, hoping to catch the culprits in the act. The operation lasted 4 days, but no one suspicious approached the boxes. It was as if the thieves knew they were being watched. That led to a more troubling thought. What if someone inside the post office was tipping them off? The Postal Service had over 200 employees in the city, from sorters to drivers to clerks. Any one of them could have access to shift rosters, collection times, and route maps. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. A retired postal worker contacted Arthur after hearing about the missing key on the local news. He explained that years ago, during a locksmith strike, the Postal Service had used a batch of master-cut keys that could open more than one route's boxes as a temporary measure. Most had been destroyed afterward, but the man admitted that a few might have gone missing. Arthur now had a chilling possibility. Key number 42 wasn't just for those 28 boxes. It might open dozens more across the city. And if the thieves had figured that out, they could cherry-pick the most lucrative locations without drawing obvious patterns. The suspicion around Glenn deepened. His alibi for the weekend of the theft was unverified, and bank records later showed he had deposited an unusually large sum of cash a week after the first reported losses. Glenn claimed it was a loan from a relative. Still, proving the theft was tricky. Without catching someone in the act or finding stolen mail in their possession, the police could only speculate. Arthur pushed for a sting operation involving marked bills in decoy envelopes, placed in targeted boxes. It was a risky move. If the thieves were as cautious as they seemed, they might detect the trap. What Arthur didn't yet realize was that the thieves were already adapting. And within days, the investigation would take a turn that suggested key number 42 was just the beginning of a much larger breach. The sting operation began quietly on a Wednesday morning. Investigators, posing as postal sorters, prepared a batch of decoy mail. Utility bills with hidden serial-numbered banknotes, fake payroll checks traceable to the post office's internal accounts, and a few greeting cards stuffed with coins to make them feel real. These letters were placed in a select group of mailboxes known to be on the key number 42 route, but with one important variation. Some were in boxes far outside that route, in different neighborhoods entirely. The idea was simple. If the stolen key had a master cut, as the retired postal worker had suggested, the thieves might try those boxes too. And if the decoy letters vanished from multiple routes, it would confirm that key number 42 was far more powerful than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Arthur P. instructed his plainclothes team to position themselves discreetly within sight of the boxes. For 2 days, nothing happened. Letters were collected on schedule, sorters logged their arrival, and the decoys reached their intended destinations without tampering. Then came Friday. By the afternoon collection, 4 of the decoy envelopes were missing, 2 from the key number 42 Financial District route, and 2 from boxes miles away in the residential north side. The pattern told Arthur exactly what he needed to know. The thieves had figured out the key's expanded reach. Worse, the timing suggested they were shadowing postal workers, striking in the window after one collection and before the next. That meant they were working in real time, following routes closely enough to avoid detection. At this point, Arthur brought in the city's fraud division. The head investigator, Detective Lena R., was a methodical woman with little patience for speculation. She began by re-interviewing Glenn M., the temporary postal worker who had signed out the key. Lena confronted him with the new evidence, including the expanded scope of the thefts. Glenn stuck to his original story that the key had been lost and that he had nothing to do with the stolen mail. But Lena noticed something in his account that Arthur had overlooked. Glenn claimed the key had slipped from his jacket pocket in the train station over the weekend. He said this as though it were a guess, but also with a peculiar certainty. The problem was, the train station he mentioned wasn't on the route between his home and the post office. In fact, it was on the opposite side of the city, near the district where 2 of the decoy letters had vanished. Still, without direct evidence, Lena couldn't arrest him. Instead, she pivoted to a different tactic, tracking the stolen negotiable money orders. These had unique serial numbers, and Lena arranged for alerts to be sent to every post office in the region. Within a week, 2 of the stolen orders were cashed both in the same small-town post office about 50 kilometers away. The teller remembered the customer clearly, a man in his 30s, average build, wearing a cap and sunglasses. He had presented both orders along with a driver's license in the name of Peter Hanley. The ID, as it turned out, was expertly forged. That detail, the quality of the forgery, convinced Lena they weren't dealing with an opportunistic thief, but with an organized operation. Forged IDs, precise timing, and selective targeting of mail suggested planning. If Glenn was involved, he wasn't working alone. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a delivery driver named Carl, who worked for a local bakery. Carl often parked near one of the financial district mailboxes to make his morning deliveries. One day, he noticed a gray sedan parked in the same spot for 3 mornings in a row, always around 9:15, just after the first mail collection. On the 3rd morning, Carl saw a man step out of the car, unlock the mailbox, retrieve a small stack of letters, and slip them into a folder before driving off. Carl remembered the car's license plate and gave it to Lena. A check revealed it was registered to a rental company, and the renter during that week had been a man named Richard L., a low-level employee at a courier firm. Surveillance of Richard began immediately. Over the next 10 days, detectives watched him drive to various mailboxes, sometimes alone, sometimes with another man who matched Glenn's description. They were careful, never taking more than a handful of letters at a time, never at the same box twice in 1 week. Finally, Lena and her team decided to move in. On the 11th day, they followed the pair to a quiet residential street where a mailbox sat at the corner. Richard parked, Glenn got out, and with casual ease, he slid a key into the lock and opened the box. He removed several letters, tucked them into his jacket, and closed the box as if nothing unusual had happened. The arrest was swift. Both men were taken into custody, and the key, worn but unmistakable, was found in Glenn's pocket. In Richard's apartment, police discovered a small workshop, tools for altering envelopes, stacks of opened mail, forged IDs, and even a crude ledger tracking the value of each theft. Under questioning, Richard admitted they had been working together for several months. Glenn had realized the value of key number 42 after noticing it opened more than just his assigned route. Instead of returning it after losing it, he had hidden it and approached Richard with a plan. They would target high-value locations, split the cash, and discard the rest. The most troubling revelation was that they had no intention of stopping. The plan was to keep the thefts small and spread out, so the losses would be chalked up to postal errors. It was only the decoy operation and Carl's sharp eye that brought them down. But as Lena reviewed the seized ledger, she noticed an odd detail. Several of the entries referred to secondary keys. Glenn claimed these were just spares for the same lock. Richard, however, insisted that Glenn had another key, one that could open boxes in a neighboring city. If that was true, the scope of the theft might be far wider than anyone suspected, and there was still no sign of how Glenn had learned about the master cuts in the first place. The interrogation room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the byproducts of long hours and longer confessions. Glenn sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at the recording device as though it might blink first. Detective Lena R., patient but relentless, had already spent 3 hours circling the same questions. Who gave you the key? Did you make a copy? Were there other routes? Glenn stuck to a half-truth. Yes, he had found the key, and yes, he realized it worked on more boxes than it should have. But he denied having any help inside the Postal Service. As for a secondary key, he brushed it off as a misunderstanding, just another key, number 42, kept in case he misplaced the original. It was Richard who broke first. After 48 hours in custody, he admitted the existence of a second key, one with a slightly different cut that opened boxes in the neighboring city of B. According to Richard, Glenn had mentioned that the second key came from a friend in maintenance who owed him a favor. That friend, Richard suspected, had access to the key cabinet after hours. When Lena followed up with the post office's maintenance staff, she found a familiar problem. The key log was incomplete, with entries sometimes filled in after the fact, and rarely in the same handwriting. Night cleaning crews had been contracted out to a private company, meaning non-postal employees had regular access to secure areas. The chain of custody for keys, it turned out, was a polite fiction. What Richard hadn't known, and what Glenn refused to confirm, was whether more keys had already been passed on to other thieves. That was the fear haunting Arthur P., the head of Postal Security. If a network of stolen or copied keys was circulating, the thefts could continue long after Glenn and Richard were off the streets. The court proceedings began swiftly. Glenn and Richard were charged with multiple counts of theft, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy to defraud. The prosecution's case hinged on the physical evidence: the original key, number 42, the forged IDs, the open letters, and the ledger detailing stolen amounts. Testimony from Carl, the bakery driver who spotted the theft in progress, became the human thread in an otherwise technical case. But it was during the trial that another unsettling fact emerged. The forensic locksmith who examined key number 42 testified that it had been modified, not simply duplicated, but altered to fit a wider range of locks than originally intended. This meant Glenn had access to tools and expertise well beyond what a temporary postal worker should have. That point was not lost on the judge. In his sentencing remarks, he described the theft as a crime of calculated precision, dependent on knowledge and resources beyond the defendant's official roles. Glenn received a 7-year prison sentence, Richard 5. Both men maintained that the other was more to blame. Yet even as the gavel fell, the bigger problem remained. Reports of missing mail didn't stop after their arrest. In fact, within 3 months, the Postal Service in the neighboring city of B reported a string of thefts eerily similar to those in H. High-value envelopes disappearing from collection boxes, with no signs of forced entry. Lena was not surprised. She had suspected all along that Glenn's so-called friend in maintenance was more than a casual accomplice. The master-cut keys were the real prize, the difference between a one-off theft and an ongoing criminal enterprise. In her final report, she urged the Postal Service to replace every single collection box lock in the region and to install tamper-evident seals. The recommendation was costly, but the alternative was living with the uncertainty of which keys were still out there. The Postal Service did eventually replace the locks, but it took over a year, and in that year, more mail disappeared. Some of it was recovered during unrelated police raids. Much of it was gone for good. The losses were quietly written off in the annual reports as operational shrinkage. For the public, the case faded into memory, filed alongside other bureaucratic embarrassments. But for postal security officials, it became a training example, a reminder that the integrity of an entire system can hinge on something as small as a single key. Years later, in a footnote buried in a security audit, There was a brief mention of an unmarked envelope arriving anonymously at the H Central Post Office. Inside was a single key, worn and smooth from use, with no note attached. It matched the cut for the B City boxes. Whether it was returned by conscience, fear, or convenience, no one ever found out. And that was the quiet irony of the post office key heist. The true damage wasn't the money or the stolen mail, but the lingering doubt about just how many more keys were still out there, hanging unnoticed on someone's wall, waiting for the right moment to be used. Story 3. The Librarian and the Lost Ledger. If you wanted to find the town library in W, you had to know where to look. It wasn't on the main square or even near the school, but tucked inside an old stone building behind the parish hall, where the narrow lanes still smelled faintly of coal smoke in winter. The library had no sign beyond a brass plate by the door, and no one ever seemed to be in a hurry there. On weekday afternoons, the sound inside was a hushed blend of turning pages, the creak of wooden chairs, and the occasional clink of the teacups kept behind the desk. At the center of it all sat Miss Eleanor Cray, the head librarian for nearly 40 years. She was known for her immaculate card catalog and the way she could find any book in the building without looking at the shelves. The trouble began quietly, as most trouble does in small towns. It was a Tuesday in late autumn when Eleanor unlocked the desk drawer where she kept the acquisitions ledger, a thick, cloth-bound book in which every purchase, donation, and deaccessioned volume had been recorded since the library's founding in 1894. She was planning to enter a modest invoice for 3 new history books, but when she pulled the drawer open, the ledger wasn't there. Eleanor was certain she had last used it the previous Thursday. The book was heavy, awkward to move, and far too large to misplace casually. She checked the returns desk, the catalog room, even the staff tea room. Nothing. At first, she told no one. In a place like W, word traveled faster than the truth, and she didn't want rumors of missing records to get out before she could find them. But after 2 days of fruitless searching, she confided in her assistant, a young part-time clerk named Martin. Martin's suggestion was simple. Maybe someone had borrowed it for research. The ledger contained detailed notes on rare books and donors, and the occasional historian or collector had asked to see it. That's when Eleanor remembered something odd. The Friday after she'd last used the ledger, a man she didn't recognize had come in asking about early 20th century local histories. He had no library card and claimed he was just visiting from the city. She had shown him to the reference section and gone back to her desk, but she now recalled hearing the soft scrape of a chair in the staff area a few minutes later. When she returned, he was gone, and the reference books he had been browsing were stacked neatly on the table. Eleanor decided to check the library's visitor sign-in sheet. The man had written J. Adams in the name column, with no address. She felt a pang of frustration. The sheet was supposed to include both. Reluctantly, she reported the missing ledger to the local constable. Constable Rayner was polite but skeptical. "A book gone missing from a library," he said, "is exactly headline news." He promised to keep an eye out, but without a suspect or proof of theft, there wasn't much he could do. Over the next week, Eleanor began to notice small but unsettling irregularities. A few books listed as checked in on the catalog cards were missing from their shelves. Several older titles that had been in the collection for decades were simply gone. When she compared these with her memory of the missing ledger, she realized they all had one thing in common. They were among the most valuable volumes in the library, not to readers, but to collectors. The ledger, she now suspected, hadn't been taken for its record-keeping value. It was a blueprint, a detailed inventory of the library's most desirable holdings, complete with acquisition dates, conditions, and donor histories. In the wrong hands, it was a shopping list for book thieves. Martin suggested they discreetly check local antique shops and book dealers. For several days, they made quiet rounds, pretending to browse. At a small shop in a neighboring town, Alina's hands trembled as she spotted a rare 1908 atlas that had been in the library's reference section for decades. The dealer claimed he had bought it from a man passing through for cash. He had no receipt, no name, and no way to trace the seller. Alina knew then that the theft was real, deliberate, and ongoing. Whoever had the ledger was systematically stripping the library of its most valuable works, one or two at a time, careful not to make the losses too obvious. She returned to Constable Rayner with the atlas in hand, her voice steady but urgent. This time he listened. A missing book could be an accident. A stolen ledger used to target specific volumes was a crime. But they still faced a major obstacle. The thief had likely copied or photographed the ledger by now. Even if they recovered it, the information could be out in the world, passed to collectors willing to buy under the table. Rayner contacted a regional police unit that specialized in cultural property crimes. They advised placing discreet marks on certain valuable books, tiny pencil notations on the inside back cover, so they could be identified if they surfaced for sale. They also suggested watching auction catalogs for any sudden influx of W library titles. For Alina, it was a strange, quiet form of warfare. She was fighting to keep her library intact, but the enemy moved invisibly, leaving no fingerprints, no forced locks, only gaps on the shelves where history used to be. And then one afternoon, Martin came into her office holding a small, unmarked envelope. Inside was a torn page from the missing ledger. Across the top margin, written in neat ink, was a single line. "If you want the rest, stop looking." Alina read it twice, then placed it flat on her desk. The message was clear and chilling. Whoever had the ledger wanted her to know they were in control. The torn page from the acquisitions ledger lay on Alina Cray's desk like an artifact from a crime scene, delicate, irreplaceable, and defiled by the inked warning. Martin hovered nearby, shifting from foot to foot, as though the very air in the office had grown heavier. "What do they mean, stop looking?" he asked. Alina didn't answer right away. She was studying the handwriting. It was neat, controlled, the kind of script you might find in an old account book, and it told her something. This wasn't a young vandal or impulsive thief. Whoever wrote this had discipline, patience, and an understanding of her world. The page itself was from an early section of the ledger, listing acquisitions from the 1910s, several local histories, a first edition travelogue, and 2 rare natural science volumes. Some of these were still in the library's collection at least. They had been last week. Alina called Constable Rayner immediately. When he arrived, he slipped on gloves and placed the page in an evidence envelope. "We'll have it checked for prints," he said, though he sounded doubtful. "But I have to warn you, if the thief, as careful as you say, they won't have left any." That night, Alina stayed late in the library, combing the shelves for gaps. She kept the lights low, working with a small desk lamp so that from the outside, the building looked closed. She found 4 more missing titles, all from the same page of the ledger. Whoever had sent the warning was taunting her with the proof of their progress. The next morning, Rayner brought in Detective Sergeant Holly Meade from the Regional Cultural Property Crimes Unit. Holly was brisk, observant, and unlike Rayner, treated the situation with immediate seriousness. "This isn't petty theft," she told Alina after a brief walk through the stacks. "This is targeted removal. Someone's working from a your list, and they're likely selling through intermediaries to private collectors or dealers who don't ask questions." Holly's first step was to discreetly photograph the library's most valuable remaining books. She asked Alina and Martin to mark any titles they suspected would be on the thief's radar, based on their knowledge of the ledger. "We're going to make these books a liability," Holly explained. "If they try to sell them, we'll have enough documentation to prove they're stolen." In parallel, she contacted auction houses and rare book dealers in a 100-mile radius, circulating a quiet alert about the missing volumes. Most were cooperative, though a few bristled at the suggestion they might unwittingly be fencing stolen goods. Within a week, the first lead emerged. A rare 1912 illustrated flora, one of the books missing from the page in the warning envelope, appeared in the catalog of a small auction house in the city. The description matched the library's copy exactly, down to a faint water stain on the back cover. Holly and Rayner attended the preview in plain clothes. The auctioneer claimed the book had come from a private estate sale. The seller was listed only as Client 47, and his identity was protected under the auction house's confidentiality policy. With a warrant, however, police obtained his details. A man named Douglas Falk, a semi-retired antiques dealer who had been quietly selling books for years. When interviewed, Falk admitted he'd bought the flora off a fellow in the trade, cash, no receipt. But Holly noticed he avoided looking at a leaner, who had accompanied them to confirm the book's identity. When pressed, Falk admitted he'd seen her once before, maybe at the library, months ago. It was an opening. Falk eventually admitted that his source was a man calling himself Adams. The name made a leaner's stomach tight. It matched the one written in the library visitor sign-in sheet the day she suspected the ledger was taken. Tracking Adams proved difficult. He used multiple phone numbers, all prepaid and unregistered, and paid for everything in cash. The only consistent detail was his appearance: tall, lean, with pale hair and an overcoat even in mild weather. Several dealers described him as knowledgeable about bindings and very particular about condition. Holly decided to bait the thief. The library had in its possession a rare but non-valuable travel diary, worth little on the open market, but easily made to look like a prize. They inserted it into the stacks, marked prominently with a penciled note that read, "See Ledger P 118, a subtle invitation only someone with the stolen ledger would understand." The diary vanished within a fortnight. This time, however, Holly's team had installed a small motion-activated camera in the reference section. The footage showed a man in an overcoat slipping the book into a leather satchel. His face was partially obscured, but a leaner recognized the build and the posture the same man who had come asking about local histories the day after she'd last seen the ledger. The trail heated up quickly. Dealers began reporting that Adams had been offering more books for sale, but with unusual haste, as though he knew the walls were closing in. One dealer in particular, a contact Holly had cultivated, agreed to arrange a meeting to inspect a set of early 20th century atlases Adams was selling. The meeting would take place in a cafe near the train station. The plan was simple: confirm his identity, detain him, and search his property for the ledger. But as often happens in cases like this, nothing went quite to plan. When Adams arrived at the cafe, he seemed wary, scanning the room before sitting down. Holly's undercover officer had barely started to flip through the atlases when Adams stiffened, glanced toward the door, and abruptly stood. He left the cafe without a word, disappearing into the crowd outside. By the time officers reached the street, he was gone. The only thing left behind was the leather satchel inside were the atlases, a few envelopes of cash, and in the innermost pocket, a brass key tagged Locker 112 East Rail Station. It was clear Adams hadn't been scared off by accident. Someone had tipped him off. Locker 112 was tucked into the farthest corner of the East Rail Station, in the row where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the floor smelled faintly of diesel. Holly Meade and Constable Rayner arrived just after dawn, before the commuter rush, warrant in hand. The lock opened with a stiff click, and the door swung inward to reveal a weathered cardboard box. Inside were neatly stacked volumes, some rare, some ordinary, but all stamped with the discreet ink seal of the W Town Library. On top lay the acquisitions ledger, its cloth cover worn at the corners but unmistakable. Eleanor's breath caught when she saw it. The ledger was intact, but as Holly flipped through it, she noticed new additions, pencil ticks next to dozens of entries, some already erased, others freshly marked. Whoever had possessed the ledger had been working methodically, item by item. There was more. Beneath the book sat a smaller tin box containing a roll of film negatives. When developed later that day, the images showed every page of the ledger photographed in crisp detail. The thief had made a complete backup, meaning the theft list could still circulate even if the original was now in police hands. The locker rental records traced back to a false name and an address that turned out to be a vacant flat. The rental had been paid in cash, 3 months in advance. It was a classic dead end. Adams, if that was even his real name, had vanished as cleanly as he'd appeared. Forensic tests on the ledger turned up no usable fingerprints, only smudges from years of handling. The books in the box were confirmed as library property, some missing for months. Their condition suggested they had been stored, not sold, perhaps held back for a more profitable future sale, or in case they became too hot to move immediately. Recovering the ledger and the books was a victory, but it was incomplete. Without Adams in custody, the investigation felt unfinished. Holly knew from experience that thieves like him rarely acted alone. Book theft rings were small but tight-knit, trading in favors, buyers, and access. Alina, though relieved to have the ledger back, couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something intangible, the trust that her library's history was safe. In the weeks that followed, she oversaw a painstaking inventory, marking every rare volume with both a discreet security tag and a hidden identifier in invisible ink. The shelves looked the same to patrons, but Alina now saw them through a lens of quiet vigilance. Holly's final report to the regional unit was clear. The suspect demonstrated familiarity with library operations, targeted items of specific value to collectors, and employed methods consistent with organized cultural property crime. Although the primary artifact, ledger, was recovered, the data it contained has been duplicated. Risk of future theft remains elevated. For months afterward, Alina kept the recovered ledger in a locked metal cabinet rather than the desk drawer where it had always been. She handled it less frequently, relying instead on photocopies for daily reference. The intimacy she once felt with its worn pages had been replaced by caution, almost suspicion, as if the book itself had been compromised. The townspeople, for their part, were largely unaware of the scale of the theft. The local paper ran a short article praising the swift recovery of missing library property, with no mention of the stolen ledger or the network of dealers who had handled the books. Holly believed this was deliberate. Too much publicity could make the remaining collection a more tempting target. But the story did circulate in whispers among librarians across the region. In their meetings and conferences, Alina became the one with the ledger case, her quiet warning taken seriously by colleagues who began rethinking their own security practices. One evening, several months later, Alina found an envelope in the library's after-hours return box. Inside was a single photograph and image of the library's reading room, taken from the mezzanine level. In the bottom right corner of the frame, just visible if you looked closely, was a man in an overcoat, head bent over a table. On the back of the photograph was a note in the same neat, controlled script as before. "You'll never know which ones are mine." Alina brought it straight to Holly, but there were no fingerprints, no identifying marks. It was a taunt, pure and simple, a reminder that the game for Adams wasn't over. In her report, Holly wrote a single sentence that stayed with Alina. In cultural property theft, recovery is not closure. The crime echoes for as long as the stolen knowledge exists somewhere else. The acquisitions ledger was back on its shelf, locked away. But in Alina's mind, the shelves of the W Town Library would never again feel entirely hers. Story 4. The train schedule switch. You don't normally look at a timetable and think crime scene. You use it the way you use a clock: glance, trust, move on. That's why the people who broke the freight network in R chose the timetable first, not the cargo seals, not the yard gates, not the guards with clipboards and thermoses. The timetable. If you stood on the main platform on a weeknight in the early 1980s, You'd see the rhythm that made the city breathe. Commuter units whispering in on polished rails, the heavy night freights grumbling through like tired giants. The announcements were steady and soothing: minutes, platforms, connections. Somewhere out past the sodium floodlights, the big yard took the weight of the country's goods: grain, spares, wire, television sets in pallets that smelled faintly of varnish and ink. The yard was its own weather system of whistles, shouts, and the long metal sigh of couplers easing together. In that world, a posted schedule, working timetable, Eastern Division, autumn revision, was law. It told crews when to step into cabs, told maintenance gangs when the rails belonged to them, told police when there was time to sweep a siding. It told thieves something else, exactly where the blind spots fell. The first person to notice anything wrong was a station woman named Elena, whose job looked boring until you watched her hands. She could stamp a ticket, take a parcel chit, answer a platform call, and flick her eye over the wall-mounted timetable with a sort of soft vigilance that comes only from routine. One rainy Tuesday, she realized the 2308 ballast train, an ugly maintenance consist no passenger ever loved, had moved to 2248 on the printed sheet. She didn't remember a bulletin about that. No matter, nights were like that. But 2 days later, she saw the down paper in a cleaning closet, the old 2308 still there. A 20-minute shift. On paper, a 20-minute shift is nothing. In a yard, it's everything. 20 minutes is a window for wagons to be remarshaled, for a set of pallets to be walked from a storage bay to a quiet corner, for the difference between the police patrol turning left instead of right. Nobody fussed, until a week later, Customs flagged a peculiar trend. A cluster of import boxes from the port warehouse reached inland factories with missing components. TV sets without tuners. Toolkits without the expensive heads. Pharmaceutical consignments with their tertiary packaging shaved just enough to replace blister cards with lookalikes. The carriers swore the seals were intact at the last interchange. The factories swore they were opening them cold. Somewhere between two lawful hands, product was evaporating. It is maddening detective work on rails. Freight moves by choreography, timestamps, seals, wheel reports. You start by trusting the paper. When the papers disagree, when a consist left at 2248 on a version of a timetable no one admits to printing, you realize the paper might be the crime. Railway police, polite to a fault, began where they always did. Seal logs, crew statements, yard access lists. The yardmaster at R, a man named Ernesto who smelled perpetually of brake dust and instant coffee, said what every yardmaster says: no strangers, everyone badged, everyone known. He gave them the roster with its comforting rows of surnames and shift codes and handwritten swaps, the kind of controlled chaos that says, this is a family, we cover each other's colds and funerals. But one column was too neat. On weeknights through the last 6 weeks, a junior dispatcher named Pavel had been shadowing the senior man in the tower, due to staff shortages. If you walked across the yard during those weeks and looked up, you would have seen their silhouettes behind the glass, two heads bent over the lamplit desk where the orders lived. A dispatcher is a quiet god. He does not touch freight, he touches time. Pavel was amiable and underpaid and said all the right things to investigators. He offered tea. He laughed with embarrassment at how much he loved small changes to working timetables. I know, nerdy, but I keep notes about when we can squeeze 5 minutes here, 3 minutes there to let maintenance have a longer block. He said he had never altered printed sheets. That was depot business. He said he had never left the desk with the train describer in auto, the mode that lets the line run itself between fixed points, except to use the bathroom. He said he had no idea how an autumn revision could disagree with itself. You know how it goes. Niceness is not innocence. The police took copies of the autumn revision from 3 points: the yard office, the station master's safe, and the notice board by Elena's window. They found 3 separate printings, same cover, same signature block, with a handful of tiny differences. In one, the 2308 ballast was 2248. In another, Two freights that normally crossed at milepost 146 were now tactically crossed at milepost 152, closer to an unlit storage spur nicknamed the Dead Dog. In the third, a routine wagon check at a level crossing was suspended on rainy days to avoid congestion. None of those changes appeared in the official change circulars from headquarters. The edit trail didn't exist. The railway print shop swore they had printed only one run. The signatures were inked by someone with a steady hand and a firm mimicry of the chief planner's looped R, yet the paper stock wasn't the same. An analyst at the police lab rubbed a corner between thumb and forefinger and said, "Local copier, not offset." Someone had run a high-quality copy, slipped it into circulation where it mattered, and binned the originals that would have contradicted it. No alarms. No klaxons, just clever paper. Meanwhile, the losses kept coming, and with them the howls from companies whose margin was built on parts you couldn't simply reprint. A pharmaceutical line halted for 3 days, a factory furloughed a week's shift. Insurance adjusters began to circle, pencils out. By law, once a seal leaves the port under customs control, every hand that touches it is an accountable point. The railway stung did something railways hate. They invited outsiders into the sanctum. Customs, trade fraud. A quiet man from the prosecutor's office, who didn't blink much and listened more. They set up in a back office off the yardmaster's corridor next to the teapot with a mess of maps taped to the wall. You could study those maps the way you'd study a chessboard. Pawn, patrol path, night, forklift routes, bishop, a night cleaner's access. The investigators looked for where the fake timetable's edits intersected with places the oversight was weakest. It turned out to be depressingly simple. The Dead Dog spur wasn't truly dead. It took overflow when the warehouse bays were jammed. It had poor lighting, a camera that had failed awaiting spares, and a gate that technically locked with a chain when not in use. In practice, if two shunters were swapping a block of wagons late, the chain stayed off for convenience. The falsified crossing at milepost 152 created a 30-minute pause in which a long merchandise freight sat breathing at the mouth of Dead Dog while the dispatcher waited for a path. In that pause, a yard tractor could creep up behind 3 wagons of mixed consumer goods, lift the back door on a single container just enough to work a practiced pair of hands inside and reverse out. Seals. Replace the numbered plastic tags with fakes. Photographs from origin. Match the angle and the timestamp with a Polaroid and a strobe. Everything would look right. It's amazing what looks right buys you in a supply chain. But there was still the problem of proof. You can't arrest a timetable. You need a person. Enter a forklift operator named Goran, who didn't talk to police on principle but did talk to his cousin, who delivered sandwiches to the yard at night. Cousin to sandwich man to police. A story about the tall one from the tower stepping out during those unusual pauses to smoke by the Dead Dog fence with a man in a white van. The van wasn't one of the contractor fleet. It held itself like a visitor. The tall one was probably Pavel. There weren't many tall dispatchers. A van in a yard is like a dog in a library. You feel it before you see it. But when the investigators asked for van logs, the guard at the gate shrugged apologetically. The night guard wrote plate numbers on a ledger page he often tore out at shift end for privacy. A family. So the team changed tactics. If the criminals were using time like a tool, the investigators would use it like a trap. They wrote their own fake timetable, a honeyed version of the honey trap, introducing a fresh maintenance block that would force a long merchandise freight to idle not at Dead Dog but 1 track closer, under a functioning camera newly cleaned, and pointed with uncharacteristic interest at a patch of darkness where a van might come to rest. The timetable went out to the same notice boards. Signed by a perfect simulation of the looped R, they cleared it with exactly 3 people and locked the new pages in the station master's safe until an hour before the shift. If the thieves had someone brushing paper, that someone would need to move fast. That was the point. What happened at 00:37 on a Wednesday is written in a report that reads like a parable of quiet crimes. The merchandise freight rolled into a gentle stop under the camera's stare. The tower called, voice even, granting the pause. 3 minutes later, a white van eased through the yard at a speed that said, "I belong." It backed into the darkness. Two figures slipped out and moved with the confidence of people who had measured steps in daylight. They worked a single container, just enough, just the right door. You could almost admire the choreography if you ignored what it took from others. They would have walked away into the old rhythm if not for one detail. The lock on the van's rear door stuck, and the taller of the two, profile crisp against the sodium lamp beyond the camera's cone, turned fully to signal the driver. The image caught a face not in panic but in irritation, the kind of look you give a drawer that fails. The investigators froze it, printed it, walked it to the tower. Ernesto, the yardmaster, closed his eyes for a second and said, softly, "Pavel." They didn't arrest him that night. They let the train move, let the van go, let the timetable live another hour. Then they went to the tower with a warrant and the slow steps that warn a man he's about to lose his view. Pavel's tea was still warm. On his desk, the official autumn revision. In the drawer below, a folder of crisp copies with the same cover and quiet edits. In his locker, nothing of note except a wad of cash wrapped in a rubber band and a shrink-wrapped stack of blank numbered seals. Good fakes, but fakes. The white van, when they found it 3 days later, had been wiped nearly clean. Nearly. Under a mat, a transit receipt from a storage unit on the Ring Road. In the unit, a depressing trove of cardboard archaeology. Replacement seals, counterfeit consignee labels, spare bolt cutters, gloves, and a laminated card with the gatehouse names and habits for the past month. Someone had done their homework. Someone had help. That was the thing the investigators couldn't shake as they booked evidence and sat with cold coffee. A dispatcher is necessary for a timetable switch, but not sufficient. Who printed the copies without setting off alarms at the depot? Who swapped the sheets on 3 notice boards from 3 different rooms without a corridor camera catching the hum of a copier? Who had the keys to the room where the station master's safe lived? And more uncomfortably, who else had learned to read time as a weapon and was already rewriting another night's clock in another yard that still believed paper equals truth? Pavel's arrest made the front page of the Our Daily Chronicle under the headline "Rail Dispatcher Charged in Freight Scheme." The article was thin on details, a timetable irregularity, and suspected cargo tampering, but it was enough to send a shiver through the railway community. Dispatchers were supposed to be the quiet guardians of order, not architects of chaos. In the yardmaster's office, Ernesto sat with his hands folded over a mug of coffee gone cold, talking to Detective Alwyn Craig from the prosecutor's office. She'd been brought in to knit the loose ends together, and there were plenty of them. Alwyn didn't bother with pleasantries. Printing those fake timetables required access to both the original layout and the right typeface, she said. That's not a thing you can just fake with an office typewriter. Ernesto grunted. Only the print shop at Central has that plate, and the plate's under lock and key. Then we need to talk to Central. At the Central print office, the manager was a short, brisk man who kept glancing at the wall clock. He insisted the plates were never removed and every timetable was printed under supervision. But Alwyn pressed him on off-hours access, and the room shifted. Yes, a few senior clerks had keys trusted people with years of service. One of them, it turned out, was a cousin of a man who worked as a night logistics consultant for a freight forwarding company. A freight forwarding company whose name had already appeared once in the investigation on a label found in the white van's glove compartment. Alwyn could smell it now. This wasn't just a dispatcher skimming goods, it was a structured operation. Someone had mapped the human landscape as carefully as the rail one, knowing which cousins and drinking buddies could open the right door. She went back to Pavel in holding. He was slouched but not broken, wearing the same faintly irritated look from the camera footage. Alwyn put the print shop cousin on the table in front of him. "You didn't draw that looped R by hand," she said. "You got the plates. You got them from someone who thought they were just doing family a favor." Pavel didn't answer, but he also didn't deny it. Instead, he shifted to something unexpected. "I'm not the only one who's done it. You'll change the locks here, swap the seals, maybe fire a few people, but it's already being done in other yards." It was a dangerous half-confession, enough to suggest he was small fry in a larger pond, but not enough to earn him a deal. Alwyn had seen the tactic before: hint at a bigger network to try and control the pace of questioning. Still, the comment aligned with her unease. The real prize might not be catching Pavel at all, but tracing the method and the people who designed it before it migrated completely out of R. The dead dog spur problem. While Pavel cooled in a cell, the investigators turned back to the spur. For years it had been a minor nuisance, a place to park overflow wagons, not a crime scene. Now they saw it for what it was: an asset for anyone who wanted to disappear a pallet or two. The camera failure wasn't accidental. A maintenance log showed a parts delay that had stretched over 7 months. The work order had been signed off by a supervisor whose brother, the team learned, owned the small lot where the white van had been parked before jobs. That lot had no visible signage, just a locked gate and a weather-faded sign that read "storage units available." Alwyn sent a search team. They found nothing but dust and a few oil stains. No goods, no gear. But neighbors remembered seeing different vans coming and going at odd hours, none with company logos. The goods themselves were harder to trace. By the time investigators had identified a stolen shipment, it had usually been broken down into components and resold through layers of intermediaries. One lead took them to a warehouse 3 towns away, where legitimate goods were stacked alongside items that matched the missing shipments, but without serial numbers or any mark linking them to the rail thefts. The warehouse manager insisted he bought stock from liquidation sales. No paperwork, of course, but plenty of cash receipts. Reconstructing the paper trail. The timetable edits fascinated Alwyn. She had the lab scan every fake sheet, comparing them to genuine ones. Under magnification, the ink patterns revealed tiny imperfections consistent across the fakes, indicating they'd been printed in batches, not one-offs. This suggested the operation was scalable. If they could do it here, they could do it anywhere. She also discovered that the distribution of timetables relied on a surprising vulnerability. Copies were sent out in unsecured courier pouches to each yard, where they were left on the station master's desk for staff to pick up. No one logged who opened them. In R, it would have been simple for an insider to swap the genuine batch for the fakes before anyone noticed. This detail: unsealed, unlogged courier pouches, went into her final risk assessment with a thick underline. The second van. Then came the sighting. A customs officer at a different yard, 200 kilometers north, reported seeing a white van idling by a dark siding late at night. The description of the driver didn't match Pavel. Too short, broader build, but the pattern was identical. A freight stop just long enough to invite interference, with a suspicious vehicle in just the right blind spot. This was the first concrete sign that Pavel might be right about other yards running the same play. But the logistics were daunting. If the method had spread, it could take months to untangle, and in that time, hundreds of thousands in goods could vanish. Pavel's leverage. When Alwyn confronted him with the northern sighting, Pavel smiled without showing teeth. "See, it's bigger than me," he said. "You want it to stop. I can help you map the rest. I know where the weak yards are, the ones with lazy locks and no cameras." "And what do you want in return?" Alwyn asked. 5 years suspended after 2. It was tempting, too tempting, but deals like that required evidence that could hold in court, not just warnings about lazy locks. Alwyn told him she'd think about it. In truth, she wasn't sure whether to see him as an informant or a distraction. The unanswered question. By the time the initial case file closed, Pavel had been charged with conspiracy, fraud, and interference with freight operations. The print shop cousin was under investigation. The dead dog spur had been locked and its camera replaced. Officially, the rail authority considered the incident contained. Unofficially, Alwyn kept the map of sightings and blind spots pinned to her office wall. Every time she glanced at it, she thought about the other yards, the other white vans, the other fake timetables no one had yet noticed. Because in the end, the timetable wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a skeleton key for the entire system, one that could still be in someone else's hands, waiting to open another gap in the clock. The trial of Pavel S. lasted less than 2 weeks, but the ripples it caused ran through the railway for years. The prosecution built its case around the camera footage, the counterfeit timetables, and the cache of blank seals found in his locker. Pavel's defense tried to argue that he was being made a scapegoat for systemic laxity, and in a way, they weren't wrong. Alwyn Craig sat in the gallery every day, not because she needed to testify, her statement was already in evidence, but because she wanted to watch Pavel's eyes. He was a man who'd built a crime on timing, and she knew timing would also dictate his future. On the morning the jury came back, she saw him glance at the wall clock as if the verdict itself was running late. They found him guilty on all major counts. The sentence, 7 years in prison. The print shop cousin was convicted of forgery and given 2 years, suspended after 1. A third man, the logistics consultant, who'd helped move stolen goods, took a plea for possession of property obtained by crime and served 18 months. On paper, it was a victory. The railway issued statements about restoring public trust, cameras were repaired, courier pouches were redesigned with tamper seals, and sightings like dead dog were either lit, locked, or decommissioned. But for those who had followed the case closely, the verdict didn't tie up the loose ends. The most important question, who designed the timetable scheme in the first place, remained unanswered. Pavel had admitted, almost casually, that others were doing it elsewhere, but no one had been charged in those yards. The northern sighting of the second white van was still under investigation, but no arrests had been made. The problem of replication. In her final report, Alwyn laid it out plainly. The danger wasn't just Pavel, it was the method. Once a working timetable could be altered without detection, the entire freight network was open to exploitation. Every vulnerable yard, every gatehouse with sloppy logs, every storage spur with a broken camera was a potential dead dog. The railway's own audit confirmed it. In the months following Pavel's arrest, inspectors quietly visited 22 yards across the network. 9 had serious security gaps. 3 still used unsecured courier pouches for timetable delivery. In one, an outdated set of schedules sat pinned to a staff board weeks after the official revision, giving anyone the chance to slip in a counterfeit. Alwyn's fear was that somewhere, a crew was already doing just that, running the same playbook Pavel had followed, with different names on the notice board. The follow-up sting. She decided to push her luck before her assignment ended. Working with the northern yard, where the suspicious second van had been spotted, she had the operations team introduce a test, timetable revision, one that created a 30-minute layover for a high-value electronics freight in a siding with newly installed covert cameras. 3 weeks passed with nothing unusual. Then, on a damp Thursday night, the cameras caught exactly what she'd hoped or feared to see. A panel van pulling up alongside the freight, 2 figures moving with quick, practiced efficiency, targeting only a single container before leaving. The van was registered to a shell company dissolved 6 months earlier. Inside, police found pallets of flat-screen televisions, most still in manufacturer's packaging. 1 man was arrested at the scene, the second fled and disappeared. His description matched a known freight thief who had once worked in a yard 300 kilometers from R. The sting proved what Pavel had claimed. The technique had spread. But it also underscored the frustrating truth: even catching one crew didn't mean you could dismantle the whole network. In places where the oversight was poor, new crews could step in almost overnight. Pavel's final card. From prison, Pavel sent Alwyn a short letter. The handwriting was blocky, impersonal. 7 years is a long time to think about other people's mistakes. You'll still be chasing vans when I'm out. If you want the real story, find the man who taught me the R. He's still on the rails. No signature, no return address, just the prison postmark. Alwyn read it twice, folded it, and put it in her desk drawer. She had a strong suspicion who the man was, but without proof, she couldn't make the accusation stick. The echo in the system. Months later, long after the press had moved on, a freight supervisor in a small yard west of the capital called Alwyn directly. He'd found a stack of timetables in the break room, all correct except for one page, where a late-night freight had been shifted by 15 minutes. The page stock was slightly different from the rest. No one claimed to know how it had gotten there. Alwyn's advice was simple: burn it, start again from scratch, and watch your spurs. Because that was the lesson of the train schedule switch. It wasn't about one dispatcher, one spur, or one city. It was about the way a single sheet of paper, doctored with care, could become the lever that moved entire wagons and the goods inside them into the shadows. Story 5. The Counterfeit Coupon Caper. If you walked into the Haversham Co-op supermarket in the spring of 1994, you might have noticed a steady stream of shoppers handing over small slips of paper at the checkout. Nothing unusual, just the kind of brand discount coupons you tore out of the weekend paper. £1 off detergent, 50 pence off cereal. Buy 2, get 1 free on tins of soup. They fluttered in baskets, peeked out from wallets, piled in the tills. No one paid them much attention. That's exactly how the people behind the scam wanted it. Coupons were a humble part of the retail ecosystem. The manufacturer paid the store back later, and shoppers felt like they'd scored a bargain. But in April that year, the redemption volume at Haversham and 3 other branches quietly tripled. Then it doubled again. Staff joked that everyone in town must be eating cereal for every meal. It wasn't until the head office reconciliation clerk rang the branch manager one Thursday morning that anyone used the word fraud. The clerk had been checking weekly coupon bundles, the envelopes of redeemed vouchers sent in for manufacturer reimbursement, and noticed something odd. Many of the coupons looked pristine, as though they'd never been crumpled in a pocket or carried through a shopping trip. The printing was perfect, the ink dense, and even the edges clean-cut rather than torn from a sheet. The manufacturer's own redemption center flagged them too. The barcodes scanned just fine, but a few of the designs hadn't actually been issued in over a year. Others offered discounts that were slightly too generous, £1 off a product that only retailed for £1.20, for example. The telltale sign was that all of them came from the same handful of stores in the same market town cluster. The system they exploited. Back then, coupon verification was almost entirely manual. A store cashier took the slip from the customer, dropped it into the till drawer, and at the end of the day, the slips went into an envelope. Once a week, the envelopes were sent to a central clearinghouse, where human clerks sorted them by manufacturer and tallied the totals for reimbursement. If the barcode matched a live promotion, payment was almost automatic. That meant a counterfeit coupon, if designed well enough, could pass through dozens of hands without being questioned. You didn't need to fool a machine. You just needed to look official enough to avoid scrutiny in the 2 seconds it took a cashier to glance at the paper. First suspicions in the store. Cashiers at Haversham remembered seeing a few customers paying with only coupons, baskets of qualifying products, total bill reduced to pennies. One woman had bought 15 jars of the same pasta sauce in a single visit. Another man seemed to shop every day, always with a stack of identical detergent vouchers. When asked, they'd smile and say they'd got them in the post. It was Martin Dawes, the branch's assistant manager, who started keeping a quiet tally. He logged the dates and times of the biggest coupon hauls, noting which cashiers had processed them. The same 4 or 5 customers kept reappearing, often choosing queues with younger or newer staff. By early May, Martin had counted hundreds of suspect coupons just from his own shifts. He called head office again, and this time the fraud prevention team got involved. The first clue: paper stock. Investigators from the manufacturer arrived unannounced one afternoon, asking to see the latest week's coupon envelope. They flipped through the stack quickly, pulling out ones that felt wrong between finger and thumb. Real coupons were printed on lightweight, fibrous paper designed to tear easily at discouraged reuse. These felt heavier, smoother, almost glossy. Under a magnifying glass, the print pattern was too crisp, lacking the slight blur of mass-printed newsprint inserts. The fraud team took samples back to their office, where they tested the ink with a simple solvent rub. Genuine coupons smudged slightly. These didn't budge at all. The conclusion was clear. Someone had access to a high-quality printer and was churning out convincing replicas. Following the money and the coupons. The trick in coupon fraud isn't just printing the fakes, it's laundering them into the legitimate redemption system. The Haversham crew did it by keeping their purchases within the rules. Each fake coupon matched a real product in the basket, so the till never flagged it as invalid. The only thing wrong was that the manufacturer hadn't actually issued those discounts. By mid-May, the fraud team had mapped the flow. The same suspects were hitting 3 or 4 stores in rotation, never the same one twice in a day. Over weeks, they'd feed hundreds of fakes into the tills, each one worth between 50p and £2. It didn't sound like much until you multiplied it by thousands of slips over months. Early estimates put the losses north of £30,000, spread across several manufacturers. A pattern emerges. It was a staff member in the branch bakery who tipped Martin to something bigger. She noticed that 2 of the frequent coupon customers always left the store and walked toward the same side street, where a small print shop sat above a locksmith. The shop advertised flyers, posters, invitations in its window. Martin passed the tip to the fraud team, who checked local business registrations. The print shop was owned by a man named Darren Cole, and Darren's sister just happened to be one of the heavy coupon users in Martin's tally. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it gave them a target. Setting the trap. The investigators decided to create their own phantom coupon, a design for a non-existent promotion on a minor product line, distributed only to the 3 stores being hit. They printed it on genuine stock, logged every serial number, and waited. The real vouchers never left the stores, but within 10 days, fakes of the same design started appearing in the tills, with the same 2 clean cuts and perfect print as before. That was the proof they needed. Whoever was making the counterfeits was copying in-store stock, not just using old newspaper inserts. It meant they were sourcing them from the store environment, likely through a staff contact or after-hours access. The question was how close they could get to catching them in the act without tipping them off. The phantom coupon had done its job. It proved beyond doubt that someone was copying vouchers directly from inside the stores. Now the challenge was catching them in the act. The fraud prevention team called in Detective Inspector Helena Price from the Regional Financial Crimes Unit. Helena had worked on currency counterfeiting cases before, and she approached the matter with the same mindset. The fake notes might be smaller and printed on thinner paper, but the operation had the same moving parts: sourcing the template, producing the forgeries, and passing them into circulation. Locking down the source. The first priority was figuring out how the suspects got their hands on genuine coupons to copy. At each of the 3 targeted stores, vouchers arrived in bundles from head office, sealed in plastic and stored in the manager's office until they were placed at promotional stands. Staff were supposed to tear them from the pad at the register when customers bought qualifying products. But a quiet audit showed a different reality. In Haversham, a full pad of detergent coupons had gone missing from the manager's desk drawer 2 weeks earlier, and no one had reported it. In the branch at Stonemere, The key to the promo cupboard hung on a hook in the staff break room. In Westby, the night cleaner had been spotted once with a stack of coupons in her apron pocket, which she claimed were dropped on the shop floor. It was in Westby that Helena found her first real lead. The night cleaner's nephew, a man in his 20s with no listed employment, had been stopped in another town the previous year for trying to pay entirely in high-value coupons at a discount store. No charges had been filed, but the incident was noted. His address was in the same part of town as Darren Cole's print shop. Watching the print shop, Helena obtained a surveillance order on the shop. From a rented flat across the street, her team filmed comings and goings for 2 weeks. Most visitors were normal customers picking up wedding invitations or poster runs. But late at night, after the shutters were down, Darren and 2 other men would wheel in boxes, sometimes from Darren's own car, other times from unmarked vans. The boxes never came back out. Heat signatures from a thermal camera suggested that a back room in the shop stayed warm for hours after closing, even on nights without printing jobs on the books. One of Helena's analysts, familiar with offset printing, pointed out that running a large format digital press would generate that exact heat profile. Following the paper trail. In a lucky break, one of the men visiting after hours was spotted unloading a case of blank A4 paper from a stationer's wholesaler, the exact high-brightness stock the fake coupons were printed on. Helena's team quietly contacted the wholesaler and learned that Darren's shop had bought enough in the past month to print at least 100,000 sheets. That was far more than they could ever need for their legitimate business. To build their case, the investigators needed to connect Darren and his crew directly to the fakes turning up in the tills. The plan was simple: bait them with another in-store coupon, this time for a high-value, free item offer that would be irresistible to counterfeit. The bait coupon. This new bait voucher offered a free box of premium chocolates with any purchase over £5. It was designed to stand out: glossy finish, gold border, holographic strip in one corner, and a unique serial number block printed in microtext. The holographic strip was real enough to pass casual inspection, but easy for the manufacturer to reproduce in-house. The legitimate versions were placed only in the 3 targeted stores, each pad carefully logged and counted daily. Within 9 days, counterfeit versions appeared in circulation, perfect to the eye, but missing the microtext serials and using a different holographic foil pattern. Helena now had her trigger. Closing the loop. On a Thursday evening, plainclothes officers entered Darren's shop posing as customers needing a rush print job. While one officer engaged Darren at the front counter, another slipped through the open back door to use the toilet and glimpsed, through an ajar storeroom door, stacks of freshly cut coupons identical to the bait design. Within an hour, Helena had a warrant signed. That night, officers raided the premises. In the back room, they found the digital press still warm, the workbench littered with trimmings, and several heavy-duty guillotines used for cutting sheets into uniform slips. Boxes of printed coupons were stacked against the wall, each marked with product names: detergent, cereal, chocolate in felt tip. In one corner, a laptop was open to a folder labeled templates, containing high-resolution scans of dozens of manufacturer coupons, including the Phantom voucher and both bait designs. Interviews and admissions. Darren was sullen in interview, claiming the prints were promotional replicas for a marketing project. But his sister, the frequent coupon user, cracked quickly. She admitted she'd been distributing stacks to friends and relatives, who would use them in the participating stores and return with either products or change from the legitimate purchases. The goods were then sold at car boot sales and discount shops for cash. The scale was staggering. Investigators estimated that in 6 months, the group had printed and circulated over 200,000 counterfeit coupons, with a potential retail impact exceeding £70,000. The scam worked because it spread the redemptions across multiple manufacturers and stores, keeping each individual loss small enough to avoid early detection. The wider web. Analysis of the laptop's contact list revealed connections to small shop owners in 3 other counties, suggesting that Darren's operation was just one node in a network. Helena passed that intelligence to counterparts elsewhere, who began tracing similar spikes in coupon redemptions. Within months, parallel arrests were made in 2 other towns, each with its own small-scale print setup. By the time Helena wrote her final report, she understood why the scheme had worked so well. It preyed on the low-value, high-volume nature of coupons, a part of retail so overlooked that, for years, no one had thought to scrutinize it closely. But she also knew one thing. Even with Darren behind bars, counterfeit coupons would always be tempting to someone with a scanner, a printer, and a few inside contacts. It was just a matter of who would try next. When Darren Cole's case went to trial in early 1995, the courtroom was packed with a strange mix. Supermarket managers, manufacturer representatives, journalists from retail trade magazines, and a handful of curious locals who'd heard about the coupon kingpin in the pub. For all its quiet mechanics, the scam had touched more lives than anyone expected. The prosecution argued that Darren's operation had drained thousands from already tight grocery margins, ultimately forcing stores to raise prices. The defense painted him as an opportunist exploiting a flawed, outdated system, no worse than someone using an expired voucher at the till. Evidence that stuck. The turning point came when the prosecution laid out the forensic printing analysis. Experts testified that the counterfeit vouchers matched Darren's shop printer model, exactly same toner composition, same cutting blade signature on the edges. The files recovered from his laptop bore creation, dates matching the peaks in coupon redemption across the 3 targeted stores. Even more damning was the bait coupon test. The jury saw side-by-side comparisons, the genuine in-store vouchers with microtext serial numbers and the fakes found in Darren's workshop missing that detail. It was, as one juror later told a reporter, like showing us a fingerprint. The inside link. 2 store employees, a night cleaner and a part-time stock clerk, took plea deals in exchange for testimony. They admitted to slipping Darren sample vouchers from promotional pads, sometimes before they were even put out for customers. One of them described how Darren would scan them the same night, tweak the offer amounts to be worth the effort, and start printing by morning. It wasn't just theft, it was an assembly line. One worker even delivered envelopes of blank manufacturer coupon stock meant for in-store displays in exchange for a cut of the profits from resale of the redeemed goods. Sentence and fallout. Darren received a 4-year prison sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud, counterfeiting, and handling stolen goods. His sister and the other family members who'd helped circulate the coupons got suspended sentences and community service. But the bigger impact came outside the courtroom. Within months, major supermarket chains and manufacturers rolled out stricter coupon controls. Serialized barcodes. Each coupon carried a unique code that could be tracked back to a store and even a specific pad. Heavier verification at tills. Cashiers were trained to scrutinize print quality, paper feel, and expiry dates more closely. Centralized redemption scanning. Instead of trusting paper bundles alone, manufacturers began digitizing every voucher on receipt, instantly flagging duplicates. Some smaller brands scrapped physical coupons entirely, shifting to store loyalty cards and electronic offers. The ripple effect in the market towns. For weeks after the arrests, locals noticed an odd drop in certain goods at car boot sales. No more piles of branded detergents at suspiciously low prices. No more 3 for £1 jars of pasta sauce with the supermarket's price stickers still attached. For the staff at Haversham Co-op, the change was welcome. Martin Dawes, the assistant manager who first tracked the suspicious coupon use, got a commendation from head office and a modest bonus. In interviews, he downplayed the heroism. "I just wrote down what I saw. Anyone could have done it." But privately, he admitted it had changed the way he looked at the checkout line forever. You start wondering how many little scams are slipping through that no one's counting. The unanswered questions. The trial tied up the core conspiracy neatly, but Helena Price knew there were still loose threads. One of Darren's contacts in another county disappeared before police could interview him. Another laptop found at a co-conspirator's house had partial templates for vouchers from brands that had never reported fraud, suggesting the operation had bigger ambitions than anyone realized. And then there was the strange fact that some of the earliest fake coupons in Haversham were for promotions no one in the group admitted producing. Were they covering for another small-time printer? Or had someone else spotted the same loophole before Darren's crew scaled it up? Legacy of the case. In the years that followed, the coupon caper became a case study in retail loss prevention seminars. Trainers emphasized that fraud didn't always look dramatic sometimes, it was just a flutter of small slips of paper, blending in with the legitimate flow of commerce. For Helena, it remained one of her most satisfying investigations, not because it took down a major organized crime syndicate, but because it exposed a system flaw that had been ignored for decades. As she told a conference crowd years later, "When we talk about fraud, people imagine briefcases of cash or offshore accounts. But the same principles apply to a 50-pence voucher. If it can be forged and spent, someone will figure out how to do it. Our job is to notice before they retire on it." And somewhere in a file cabinet in the Financial Crimes Unit, the original bait coupon holographic strip glinting under the light still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve. A reminder that sometimes, even the most boring crimes can rewrite the rules of the game. Story 6. The Library Ledger Heist. You don't expect crime in a library. You expect creaky ladders on rolling rails, a quiet cough somewhere in the stacks, the thump of a hardback returning to its shelf. But in the spring of 1987, the Eastwood Public Archive, a squat brick building on the edge of a fatting industrial town, became the scene of a theft so quiet that it went unnoticed for months. It began, like many such stories, with a ledger. Not just any ledger, but a century-old, handwritten account book documenting the purchase and sale of land parcels that would later form part of the town's historic district. The book wasn't worth much in terms of materials bound in scuffed calfskin, paper foxed with age, but its contents were unique. Each entry held signatures of early town founders, some long-lost survey maps, and marginalia about property disputes. To a collector of rare ephemera, it was priceless. To the town clerk, it was an irreplaceable legal record. The first hint. The theft was discovered by accident. Marjorie Lane, a part-time volunteer, was dusting the locked glass cabinet in the local history room when she noticed the ledger was gone. She assumed it had been checked out by the archivist for cataloging, but a quick look at the sign-out sheet showed the last recorded handling was 3 years earlier. No one had signed it out since. At first, the library director suspected a misfiling. Perhaps it had been shelved with the other land records in the basement. Weeks of searching turned up nothing. Only then did they call the police. An overlooked crime scene. Detective Ian Rowntree wasn't thrilled to be assigned the case. A missing book hardly seemed pressing compared to burglaries and assaults. But when he visited the scene, he realized how exposed the library's treasures really were. The locked cabinet was secured with a tiny brass key, kept in an unlocked desk drawer. The local history room was often left unattended, and the building had no cameras, not unusual in a pre-digital age. Anyone with a few minutes alone could open the cabinet, slip the book into a bag, and walk out without attracting attention. Rowntree made a list of everyone with access. The archivist, 2 volunteers, the cleaning crew, and a handful of researchers who'd requested special access to the cabinet in the past year. A name from the past. In flipping through old sign-in logs, Rowntree saw a name that stopped him: Gerald Hesketh. Gerald had been a quiet fixture in the town until 5 years earlier, when he moved to a neighboring county after a brief, embarrassing scandal. He'd been caught trying to sell a bundle of old railway timetables to a collector in London. Items later confirmed to have been taken from a shuttered station's office without permission. He served no prison time, only a fine, but local historians still muttered about it. And here was his name twice in the library visitor log within 6 months of the ledger's disappearance. Following the paper trail, Rowntree learned that Gerald now ran a small antique stall at the weekend market, specializing in transport and industrial history. Undercover officers visited the stall, pretending to be collectors, and noted a few oddities: maps with Eastwood survey stamps, invoices bearing signatures of 19th-century town officials. None were from the missing ledger, but they hinted at a source. One officer spotted a subtle habit. Gerald always asked buyers if they wanted more from the same series and offered to bring them next time. It suggested he had an ongoing supply or access to a hidden cache. The auction lead. The real break came from a tip-off. A dealer in rare manuscripts who'd once been burned by buying stolen library books called the police after seeing an auction catalog from a small house in Devon. Lot 42 was described as property records and survey maps, Eastwood, 1880-1890, bound in calf. The photographs in the catalog matched the missing ledger exactly. The auction house confirmed the seller as G. Hesketh, private collection, and that the lot had been consigned weeks earlier. Intervention. Rowntree moved quickly. He contacted the auction house, explained the situation, and arranged for the ledger to be withdrawn from sale pending investigation. When officers confronted Gerald, he claimed he'd found it in a box of books purchased at an estate sale. But the auction paperwork told another story. It showed the ledger had been in his possession for at least 6 months before consignment, with handwritten notes inside in his own distinctive hand. The quiet damage done. Recovering the ledger didn't undo the harm. Archivists found that several maps had been carefully removed, likely sold separately, and replaced with blank sheets to mask the loss. Some marginalia had been clipped away, perhaps for the signatures alone. It was a strange kind of vandalism, theft not of the whole but of the choicest parts. It turned the ledger into a hollow version of itself, and even when repaired, the gaps would always remain. By the time Rowntree filed his first report, the question hanging over the case wasn't just who took the ledger, but how many other pieces had already walked out the library doors without anyone noticing. Detective Ian Rowntree had the stolen ledger locked away in the police evidence room, but he knew that possession was only half the battle. Convicting Gerald Hesketh would require linking him not just to the sale attempt, but to the theft itself. That meant building a case from a trail of dust, paper fibers, and whispers in the collector community. Building the timeline. The first step was to reconstruct when the ledger left the Eastwood Public Archive. Rowntree returned to the visitor logs and found something easy to miss. Gerald's 2 documented visits were both on Tuesdays, days when the archive's sole archivist, Mrs. Wendy Carter, worked half days, and the local history room sat unmonitored for hours. Interviews with staff confirmed that on one of those visits, Gerald had asked to see a specific bound set of railway plans. Those were kept in the same locked cabinet as the ledger. Mrs. Carter recalled retrieving the plans for him, leaving him at the reading table while she assisted another visitor elsewhere. She couldn't remember how long he'd been alone. It was a tiny window of opportunity, 10, maybe 15 minutes, but enough for someone who knew what they were after. A network in the shadows. As Rowntree dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Gerald's name popped up in correspondence between niche dealers of industrial heritage documents. These weren't mainstream antiquarian bookshops, but small-time traders working from home, fairs, and market stalls. The The police cyber unit, primitive in the late 80s but functional enough, intercepted telex messages and early fax traffic that showed Gerald offering municipal record books and survey maps without provenance. Collectors are a discreet breed, but one agreed to talk in exchange for anonymity. He described Gerald as a man who'd sell you a fragment rather than the whole thing, a corner of a map, a clipped signature if it meant squeezing more profit. That matched the vandalism found in the recovered ledger. The missing maps. Archivist Wendy Carter helped police compile a list of specific maps missing from the ledger. These were not decorative flourishes, but key historical artifacts, large-format survey diagrams showing property divisions before the construction of the town's main railway. A month later, Ronetree's team found 2 of them for sale in a dealer's glass case at a Manchester antiques fair. The seller claimed he'd bought them from a chap in the market for cash. He couldn't or wouldn't produce a receipt, but under pressure admitted the seller was Gerald. Confrontation and denial. When Ronetree confronted Gerald with the recovered maps and the ledger, Gerald stuck to his story. "If it was stolen, I didn't know. Things pass through my hands quickly, I can't trace every item." But Ronetree had something stronger. The auction house's consignment form, signed by Gerald, listing 1 ledger, Eastwood Property Records, with an estimated value of £3,000. The form was dated months before Gerald claimed to have found the book. A crime of habit. What began as a single theft investigation grew into a broader inquiry. Police began revisiting unsolved cases of missing municipal documents from small libraries across the county. Several bore Gerald's fingerprints metaphorically, and, in one case, literally. In a file folder of stolen tramway blueprints recovered from a dealer's storage unit, forensic examiners lifted a partial print matching Gerald's right thumb. Proving the entry. The toughest element was proving Gerald physically took the ledger from the library. There was no CCTV in 1987, no eyewitness, and no break-in because he hadn't needed to break in. Ronetree relied on a combination of circumstantial evidence. Gerald's access to the room on days it was unattended. His known history of trading in public records without provenance. The auction paperwork proving prior possession. The recovered maps matching those missing from the ledger. It was enough for the Crown Prosecution Service to proceed. Trial strategy. The prosecution leaned heavily on the pattern. This was not an opportunistic snatch of an old book. It was part of an ongoing pattern of targeting neglected public collections for private gain. They brought in archivists from other towns to testify about losses eerily similar in method. The defense tried to paint Gerald as a harmless enthusiast who simply didn't keep good records of his purchases. But the jury wasn't swayed by the image of a bumbling collector. The missing maps, the clipped margins, and the auction listing spoke louder. A deal on the table. Just as the trial was about to begin, Gerald's solicitor approached with an offer. A guilty plea to 1 count of handling stolen goods in exchange for dropping multiple counts of theft. Ronetree was torn. Accepting the deal meant Gerald would avoid a lengthy prison term, but rejecting it risked an acquittal on the theft charges due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence. The CPS accepted the plea, citing the importance of recovering the ledger intact and setting a precedent that stolen public records could and would be prosecuted. When sentencing came, the judge called Gerald's actions a calculated exploitation of the trust placed in public access to history. He received 18 months in prison, of which he served just over a year. Yet as Ronetree left court, he couldn't shake the nagging thought. If Gerald admitted to only this one theft, how many other ledgers, maps, and plans were out there, stripped from their bindings, hiding in plain sight on collectors' shelves? When Gerald Hesketh walked out of Stoneford Prison in the winter of 1989, the Eastwood Public Archive already had its missing ledger back patched, repaired, but forever incomplete. Detective Ian Rowntree, meanwhile, had moved on to other cases, yet the Hesketh file never quite left his desk drawer. It wasn't just about the man, it was about the method. Aftermath at the archive. The return of the ledger brought no real celebration. Archivist Wendy Carter and her small team had to face the uncomfortable truth. They had failed to protect a one-of-a-kind historical record. In the months following the trial, the town council invested in stronger cabinets, a sign-in-sign-out protocol requiring ID, and for the first time a locked, climate-controlled room accessible only with staff escort. But the changes came too late to undo what Gerald had done. Of the 8 maps removed, only 2 had been recovered. The others were likely in private collections, where owners might never admit their origins. As for the clipped signatures, those were almost certainly gone forever, framed on a wall or tucked into someone's personal scrapbook. The web unravels. Rowntree's quiet obsession with the case deepened when, 2 years later, he was assigned to a theft from the municipal archive in Barrowford, 40 miles north of Eastwood. The modus operandi was eerily familiar. No signs of forced entry, targeted removal of maps and marginalia from bound records, and the rest left behind. Through a network of police contacts, Rowntree began mapping similar incidents across the region. A troubling picture emerged. Over the past decade, small-town archives, historical societies, and railway clubs had all suffered losses of rare or unique documents. Many had never been reported to police, chalked up instead to misfiling or lost during reorganization. In at least 5 of those cases, Gerald Hesketh's name appeared in visitor logs or correspondence with local history groups. Reaching out to the collectors. Rowntree knew the missing items weren't disappearing into thin air, they were being sold. But collectors rarely volunteered information to police, wary of losing their acquisitions or being implicated in receiving stolen goods. One breakthrough came when an elderly collector from Leeds, fearing his heirs might unknowingly sell dodgy items, invited Rowntree to review his holdings. Among the shelves, Rowntree found a single sheet of parchment with the seal of Eastwood's mayor from 1884, a seal identical to those found in the missing ledger. The man had bought it from a dealer in the early 80s. That dealer, when traced, admitted to getting a batch from Gerald. It wasn't enough for a new prosecution, but it proved something Rowntree already suspected. Gerald's operation had been far bigger than the single theft that put him behind bars. Hesketh's second act. By the early 90s, Gerald was back at the weekend markets. He was more cautious now, rarely handling bound volumes, but still trading in loose, historical documents. These were harder to trace. A map without its binding or a letter without its original context could be almost impossible to prove stolen. Archivists began quietly sharing photographs of vulnerable items between institutions, hopping to spot missing materials if they turned up for sale. Rowntree, in semi-official capacity, became a point of contact for these tips. Over the next 5 years, at least a dozen items were recovered this way, though none were damning enough to build a fresh case against Gerald. He seemed to understand the thin line he was walking, keeping his activities just within the realm of plausible deniability. Legacy of distrust. The greatest damage Gerald left behind wasn't the physical loss of the ledger's contents. It was the change in attitude among archivists and researchers. Before the theft, Eastwood's local history room had been a friendly, open space, a quiet refuge for students, genealogists, and casual visitors alike. After the theft, access became restricted, guarded, and tinged with suspicion. Longtime patrons noticed. It used to be that you could spend a whole afternoon alone with the records, one amateur historian complained to the local paper. Now it feels like you're under surveillance. The article made no mention of the ledger theft by name, but the implication was clear. One man's greed had soured the environment for everyone. A missing ending. In 1998, Gerald died suddenly of a heart attack at age 62. His flat was emptied by a distant cousin who, perhaps unknowingly, consigned most of its contents to a local auction house. Among the boxes were hundreds of old timetables, maps, and documents, some legitimately acquired, others more suspect. The Eastwood Ledger maps were not among them. For Rowntree, who attended the auction in plain clothes, it was a bittersweet moment. Without Gerald alive to question, the full scope of his thefts would never be known. The ledger case was closed on paper, but in reality, it remained unfinished. Reflections on a quiet crime. The library ledger heist was no jewel robbery or high-speed chase. There were no masked intruders, no alarms in the night. It was a crime that happened in plain sight, in a place people assumed was too mundane to be targeted. And that, perhaps, was the lesson Rowntree carried forward. In the absence of vigilance, even the quietest corners can attract the wrong kind of attention. Somewhere in a study or behind glass in a private collection, the missing maps from the Eastwood Ledger may still rest admired for their beauty, valued for their age, but stripped forever from the story that gave them meaning. And in a way, that loss is the real crime. Story 7. The Coin Collector's Swindle. On a gray March afternoon in 1994, the polished oak doors of Linton Numismatics swung open for the start of the monthly appraisal day. Retired teachers, hobbyists, and a few cautious investors shuffled in, clutching envelopes, cigar boxes, and biscuit tins filled with coins. Most wanted an opinion, some wanted to sell, and all expected polite expertise from the man behind the counter, Mr. Peter Lomas. To the untrained eye, Peter looked every bit the scholarly coin dealer. Neat gray suit, rimless glasses, careful diction. But to those in the trade, he was something else entirely, a man with a reputation for being able to place coins that were too good to be true and too conveniently lacking in provenance. The first suspicions. It began, as many quiet crimes do, with something small. A single silver penny, minted under the reign of Edward the Confessor, brought in by an elderly widow named Mrs. Mabel Crowther. She explained that her late husband had found it decades earlier during a garden renovation and had kept it in a drawer ever since. She didn't know its worth, she only wanted to know if it was genuine. Peter examined it under his magnifying glass, nodded gravely, and said it was an interesting replica, offering her £50 for it as a curiosity. Mabel, flustered, agreed. 2 months later, the same penny turned up in a London auction catalogue, authenticated as genuine, with a reserve price of £1,200. It was purchased by a private collector for more than double that. A pattern emerges. When Mrs. Crowther's nephew, a young solicitor named Thomas Briggs, saw the auction listing, he suspected Peter had taken advantage of her. But when he tried to confront him, Peter brushed it off as coincidence. "Coins of that type turn up often," he said. "You can't prove it's the same one." Thomas might have let it go had it not been for another elderly seller, Mr. Harold Pierce, who claimed Peter had bought his late father's collection for scrap value, and later sold several pieces through a Birmingham dealer for many times the price. Word began to spread quietly among the small but tight-knit coin-collecting community. Lomas was paying low and selling high, and not just by a little. Enter Detective Sergeant Ruth Keene. D.S. Ruth Keene of the Linton CID didn't normally handle matters of coin fraud. But when a formal complaint landed on her desk from the County Trading Standards Office, backed by affidavits from 4 separate sellers, she decided it was worth a closer look. Her first challenge was the lack of paperwork. Many of Peter's transactions were done in cash, with no receipts, under the guise of friendly advice or off-the-books valuations. This made it nearly impossible to track the coins once they left the seller's hands. But Keene knew that the rare coin market, for all its secrecy, had one unavoidable paper trail: auction house catalogs. Following the catalogs, Keene and her team began combing through years of catalogs from major and mid-tier auction houses. They looked for coins that matched descriptions from complainants, not just type, but where patterns, scratches, and tunning. Within weeks, they had matched at least 7 coins sold by Lomas to items described in complaints. Each one had been purchased by Peter for a fraction of its auction price, often under misleading pretenses about its authenticity or market value. One example stood out: a gold sovereign from 1817, the first year of its minting, sold by a widower to Lomas for £200 after being told it was a nice keepsake but not investment grade. 3 months later, it fetched £2,800 at a London sale. The human cost. Keene began interviewing victims in person. The stories were strikingly similar: elderly owners, often alone, with no deep knowledge of numismatics, trusting Peter's professional opinion. Many spoke of his calm, reassuring tone, his promise that they were getting a fair deal, and his willingness to pay cash on the spot. For some, the financial loss was significant: holiday plans canceled, home repairs delayed. For others, the emotional sting was worse. These were coins tied to family history, heirlooms passed down through generations, now gone under false pretenses. Lomas's defense. When questioned, Peter remained cool. "I buy low and sell high. That's business. I never force anyone to sell. If they accept my offer, that's their choice." Legally, he wasn't entirely wrong unless Keene could prove deliberate misrepresentation. The difficulty was that in the world of collectibles, value is a slippery concept, and expert opinions can vary wildly. Still, Keene suspected there was more at play. Peter wasn't just undervaluing coins. He was actively deceiving sellers about authenticity and rarity to justify rock-bottom offers. A breakthrough lead. The case turned when a junior clerk at the Linton branch of Midlands Bank contacted police. He had noticed that Peter often deposited large sums in cash, just under the reporting threshold shortly after appraisal days. The timing was too consistent to ignore. Tracing the deposits alongside auction sales provided a partial but compelling map of Lomas's operations. It showed a clear pattern: purchase from elderly seller, right arrow deposit, cash, right arrow auction sale at significant markup within months. The unanswered question. Even with the growing evidence, Keene faced a fundamental problem: proving intent. Was Peter's habit a case of sharp but legal business, or was it criminal fraud? As she prepared to bring her findings to the Crown Prosecution Service, she kept coming back to one key detail. If she could find proof that Peter had knowingly lied about the authenticity of a coin to lower its price, she could make the case stick. The answer, she suspected, might lie not in the coins themselves, but in the words Peter had spoken in his shop. And that's where the trail leads next. A quiet corner of Linton, a listening device, and a man too confident to realize he was already being recorded. Detective Sergeant Ruth Keene knew that the rare coin trade thrived on two things: trust and secrecy. Break the first, and you lost customers. Break the second, and you lost your peers. If Peter Lomas's reputation among collectors was already under quiet suspicion, Keene's job was to turn that whisper into evidence that would stand in court. Setting the trap. The plan was simple in theory but delicate in execution. Plant an undercover officer posing as an elderly coin seller, record the appraisal, and see whether Peter would misrepresent the coin's value. Finding the right bait took time. The police needed coins that were both genuinely valuable and plausibly part of a private inheritance. Fortunately, the county museum agreed to loan several mid-tier historical coins for the sting, insured, cataloged, and each with a unique, easily identifiable marking invisible to the naked eye. The role of the seller fell to Detective Constable Arthur Briggs, an officer in his early 60s who could pass for a recently widowed hobbyist. He rehearsed the cover story. His late wife's uncle had left him some old coins, and he was looking for a fair valuation before deciding whether to sell. The appraisal day encounter. On a damp Thursday morning, Arthur walked into Linton Numismatics, coins wrapped in an old tea towel, voice pitched with the slight uncertainty of someone out of his depth. Peter greeted him with the usual genial warmth, offering tea and asking where the coins had come from. As Arthur laid them out on the felt mat, Peter's eyes flickered briefly that telltale flash of recognition. He picked up a silver crown from 1707, turning it slowly under the lamp. "Well, it's in decent condition," he said, "but these are common. You might get £40 for it if you're lucky." Arthur nodded slowly, masking his surprise. Keene, listening from the unmarked van parked outside, knew the truth. That coin alone was worth between £500 and £700 to the right collector. Peter continued in the same vein. The Victorian gold half-sovereign was a bit worn and only worth melt value, another gross undervaluation. Catching the lie. The key moment came when Peter examined an Edward VI shilling, one of the museum's most pristine examples. "Oh dear," he murmured, "I'm afraid this is a reproduction. Nicely done, but not original. I could take it off your hands for £10 as a novelty." This was exactly what Keene had hoped for, a deliberate falsehood about authenticity, delivered with authority to manipulate the sale price. Arthur, playing his part, hesitated but eventually agreed to sell the lot for Peter's offered total of £300. The coins were bagged, cash was handed over, and Peter, unaware of the sting, even gave Arthur a business card, suggesting he might bring in any more bits and pieces lying around. Building the case. With the recording secured, Keene now had evidence of Peter knowingly misrepresenting a coin's authenticity to drive down its price. This was the leverage she needed to frame the broader pattern of behavior as fraud rather than mere sharp dealing. Over the next 6 weeks, she and her team compiled a dossier. Auction records linking Peter's purchases to high-value sales. Victim statements from at least 12 sellers with similar stories. Financial record showing deposits matching auction proceeds. Undercover recording of Peter's false statements about the Edward VI shilling. The Crown Prosecution Service agreed there was a strong enough case to proceed. The arrest. Peter was arrested one Monday morning just as he arrived to open the shop. The charges: multiple counts of fraud by false representation, each tied to a specific incident where evidence showed he had deliberately undervalued and misrepresented coins to sellers. The local paper ran the story the next day under the headline, "Respected coin dealer accused of cheating elderly clients." The numismatic community, long accustomed to whispers about Lomas's practices, reacted with a mix of vindication and discomfort. The courtroom drama. During the trial, Peter's defense leaned heavily on the idea that valuations were subjective. His barrister argued that coins' worth varied depending on the market, condition, and buyer interest, all perfectly legal factors in negotiation. But the prosecution returned again and again to the undercover tape, playing Peter's calm assertion that the Edward VI shilling was a reproduction against the expert testimony of the county museum's curator, who described it as genuine, rare, and exceptionally well preserved. In cross-examination, Peter admitted he knew the coin was genuine but claimed he was speaking casually and that Arthur must have misunderstood. The jury didn't buy it. Verdict and sentencing. After 3 days of deliberation, Peter was found guilty on 8 counts of fraud. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison, noting the calculated nature of his crimes and the targeting of elderly, often vulnerable individuals. For many of his victims, the conviction was less about money than about principle. "He looked me in the eye and lied," Mrs. Crowther told reporters outside the courthouse. "I can forgive losing a coin, but I can't forgive being treated like a fool." Loose ends. Even with the conviction, many of Peter's past dealings remained murky. The police recovered some coins and returned them to their rightful owners, but others were already in private collections abroad, their origins now irretrievably blurred. For Keene, the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that, in the world of collectibles, there would always be another Peter Lomas, another dealer ready to exploit trust for profit. But the question that lingered wasn't whether Peter had cheated dozens of people. That was settled. It was how many more sellers, too embarrassed or unaware to come forward, had walked away from his shop believing they'd simply made a bad bargain. And somewhere in Lomas's tidy records, if they even existed, might lie the answer to just how deep the swindle ran. Peter Lomas entered prison with the same composure he had shown in the dock, an unruffled air that suggested this was a temporary inconvenience rather than a moral reckoning. For Detective Sergeant Ruth Keene, the case file was formally closed, but the aftershocks of the investigation were only just beginning to ripple through the world of British numismatics. The auction house backlash. Within weeks of the verdict, several regional auction houses quietly updated their consignment policies. Previously, coins could be accepted with little more than the consignor's ID and a signed declaration of ownership. Now, provenance checks became standard practice, especially for high-value items. Some dealers grumbled that the changes would slow business and deter casual sellers. But to Keene, the reforms were one of the case's most tangible successes, a small barrier against the kind of quiet exploitation Peter had thrived on. One London auctioneer admitted privately to her, "We always suspected some dealers were squeezing sellers, but it wasn't our job to police the private market. This has made us rethink that." Returning the stolen history. Recovering the coins was another matter. Keene's team had traced about 24 items that matched victims' descriptions, some still in the possession of the auction houses, others with collectors willing to return them for reimbursement. But more than half of the identified coins were gone sold at international shows, swapped between collectors, or shipped overseas. In one particularly bitter case, a widow named Irene Frost learned that her late father's collection sold to Peter for a couple £100 had been broken up and sold in Germany for over £25,000. The coins were now scattered in at least 4 countries. "It's like losing him all over again," she told a local paper. The human tally. By the end of the restitution process, the financial losses tallied up to more than £300,000, and that was only for the victims who came forward. Keene suspected the true figure was closer to $500,000. Many victims admitted they had hesitated to report their losses because they felt foolish for trusting Peter. That sense of shame, Keene reflected, was one of the cruelest parts of the crime. Unlike a burglary, where the victim's innocence is obvious, these were cases where the con relied on the victim's cooperation, however unwitting. Life inside for Lomas. From prison, Peter maintained a low profile. He kept mostly to himself, reading, writing letters, and even corresponding with a few former clients who, astonishingly, still defended him. "Peter always gave me a fair deal," one wrote to a trade magazine, "and I'd sell to him again in a heartbeat." It was a reminder that, in the world of collectibles, loyalty and personal rapport could outweigh even a court's judgment. Rumors swirled that Peter was already planning his comeback, perhaps in another niche market less scrutinized than coins. Stamps, perhaps, or rare maps. The detective's reflection. For Keene, the Lomas case became something of a benchmark in her career. Not the most dramatic, there were no car chases or violent confrontations, but one of the most meticulous and quietly satisfying. She often used it in training sessions for new detectives, pointing out how the entire case hinged on details. The invisible museum markings on the Sting coins, the careful matching of auction catalog, photos to victim descriptions, the patience to follow a paper trail that many would have considered too dull to bother with. "Criminals like Lomas," she would tell recruits, Don't count on you being stupid, they count on you being bored. The market moves on. By 2001, 7 years after Peter's arrest, the Linton numismatics shopfront had been converted into a cafe. The sign above the door was long gone, and few passers-by remembered the man who once held court inside. The coin market, meanwhile, had adapted. Online forums and early eBay listings gave sellers more options and transparency. Prices became easier to compare, and scams harder, though never impossible, to pull off. Some of Peter's former victims even found new passion in collecting, joining local clubs where members shared knowledge to avoid being taken advantage of again. The unsolved mystery. And yet, one aspect of the case remained a thorn in Keene's mind. During the financial investigation, her team found evidence of significant cash withdrawals, more than £80,000 over a 2-year period, that could not be linked to known purchases or sales. The withdrawals stopped abruptly just weeks before Peter's arrest. Keene always suspected that this money had been used to buy an unrecorded private hoard of coins, stored somewhere outside official channels. If such a stash existed, it was never found. From time to time, rare coins with no clear provenance still surfaced at auctions in the Midlands, coins that bore a resemblance to pieces described by victims, but had never been proven stolen. Whether they came from Lomas's hidden hoard, or were merely another coincidence in the murky world of collectibles, no one could say for certain. Epilogue: a quiet warning. In the years that followed, the coin collector's swindle case became a quiet cautionary tale told in club meetings and appraisal days. New collectors learned to seek multiple opinions before selling, to demand receipts, and to keep records of provenance. Peter Lomas served his sentence, and upon release, moved to a coastal town under a different name. Officially, he left the coin trade. Unofficially, there were occasional whispers of him turning up at antique fairs, lingering by the numismatic stalls, asking careful questions. The market had moved on, but the method, slow, deliberate, cloaked in expertise, would always have a place in the shadows. And that was the truth Keene knew too well. In crimes like this, it wasn't the rarity of the coins that made them valuable to the criminal. It was the rarity of suspicion.